Deaf Again, Chapter 6. As the elementary school years drew to a close, it was time to start thinking about high school. During my final year at PMFS, which runs from kindergarten to 6th grade, my grandparents looked for another school where I would continue to receive a quality education. They heard that Germantown Friends School was one of the best schools in Philadelphia and decided that this would be my next step. Since DFS is also a Friends school, it would provide a continuation of the teaching style and Quaker philosophy I had grown accustomed to at PMFS. A wonderful program with a rigorous academic curriculum, this was practically Harvard High School. Virtually all GMFS graduates go on to greater academic achievements in post-secondary programs, including a considerable number of Ivy League colleges, a phenomenal success rate that continues to this day. Along with 5 other PMFS classmates, I took an entrance exam at GFS that was supposed to determine whether or not we had what it took to survive the challenging curriculum. A few weeks later, we whooped it up in celebration when we found out we'd all been accepted. Oops, not so fast. The other 5 were definitely in as far as the entrance exam indicated, so was I. But a few things needed to be cleared up first. The faculty at GFS had heard about my promising academic potential, but they'd also heard about my deafness. This was not the cute, cozy environment of PMFS. This was a relatively large school with 900 students. It needed to be assessed as to whether or not I could survive in what would prove to be a difficult environment for a deaf kid. A one-day visit was scheduled so that I could get a taste of the life at GFS. This one-day visit is granted to all incoming GFS students so they know what to expect when they enroll. For me, however, this visit was going to be the final say in whether or not I would be accepted. Not only would I get to see what life at GFS was like, but also the faculty would be evaluating my ability to function in a large hearing school. When I arrived at GFS for my introductory visit, I knew very well what was at stake here. My grandfather had explained loud and clear the real purpose of this visit. I knew he was really rooting for me to get in, and I didn't want to let him down. To GFS credit, they didn't beat around the bush. I was escorted to Mr. Emerson's office, and he got right down to the bottom line. He was happy to see me there, but he also wanted to see how my deafness would affect me in the classroom. I would attend a number of classes and then return at the end of the day to discuss how it went. My escort for the day was then ushered in. I smiled in delight. It was Ian, an old neighborhood friend of mine whom I knew very well. Whether this was prearranged or just plain dumb luck, I don't know. Either way, I was certainly grateful to have him showing me around. Of course, we hit it off well because we'd grown up next door from each other. This was a considerable advantage because I was at ease with interacting with him. Ian also took the time to tactically explain to his friends that I was deaf, and they treated me with kindness and respect. For a day, it looked like the deaf stranger had waltzed in and quickly won over his potential classmates. The teachers noticed this and must have thought, hey, this deaf kid is pretty cool. He can hang with the best of them. To be honest, though, 90% of the time, I had no idea what was going on. It was a big school, and I found it rather intimidating. If it weren't for Ian and his circle of friends, I probably would have run out of there completely terrorized. Classes were a blur. I didn't understand one word the teachers and the students said. I just smiled when the other people smiled, chuckled when the other people chuckled, and tried my best to look like I fit in. I didn't want to let my grandfather down, and I didn't plan to. I was going into this school even if I had to put on an Oscar performance to do it. Finally, at the end of the day, I returned to Mr. Emerson's office. Conversing with him was no problem because I was pretty much okay at a one-on-one conversation. It was the groups, especially classroom discussions, that had me lost in space. Mr. Emerson opened our meeting by asking how my day had gone. I replied that it had gone just fine. He probed a bit more and asked if my deafness affected my ability to participate in class. I assured him that I was on top of everything. My lip reading skills, I insisted, allowed me to understand most of what was going on. Yes, I assured him I had most definitely enjoyed my visit. Then I gave him the same balony my grandfather told him and everyone else. With the hearing aid, I'm practically the same as any other normal kid. That was it. I was in. I was a liar, but I was in. The nominee for Best Actor is. Settling in at GFS was not going to be easy. I knew it, and my family knew it. But my grandfather had an encounter with someone who inspired him to give me a little pep talk. He'd bump into Dr. Cash, a very successful deaf man who happened to be a prominent surgeon. I'd heard of him before, and I was surprised to find out that he had a long heart-to-heart talk with my grandfather. It was the first time Grandpop had met such a well-to-do deaf adult, and he took advantage of the opportunity to discuss a number of issues related to deafness. Shortly before I began the 7th grade at GFS, my grandfather decided to disclose the entire content of this discussion with Dr. Cash. He looked dead serious. Mark, do you remember Dr. Cash, the surgeon? He has a hearing problem just like yours, and he's a doctor. Well, I was talking to him about you going to GFS. He said he doesn't think you're going to make it. Oh, great, I thought. Nice way to boost my confidence. Incidentally, my grandfather continued, Dr. Cash himself went to GFS for a short time. It didn't work out. He said that no deaf person ever has, nor ever will graduate from GFS. I think you can prove him wrong. Now I was getting psyched, and a sense of pride clicked inside me. Yes, I knew Dr. Cash was only being realistic. He knew firsthand that GFS was a tough school for anyone. The school had enough academic challenges as it was. Throw in a progressively worsening hearing loss, and that might have been one challenge too many. Nonetheless, I was determined to show that I had what it takes. I knew it was going to be a formidable task, but I was going to make it. As determined as I was to succeed at GFS, it immediately became a difficult transition. At PMFS, everyone had known me, and I had also been one of the best athletes in the whole school. At GFS, I was just a face in the crowd, and I was a mediocre athlete among the many students. I was lost in the classroom and relegated to the B squad on the soccer team. Yes, these are normal frustrations experienced by anyone who moves to a bigger school. But for me, they were magnified. My deafness made it much harder to adapt. It was hard to make new friends, and it was hard to believe I'd ever be comfortable there because I understood so little of what went on. It was a chore trying to read everyone's lips. It was frustrating when homeroom teachers reminded me to wear my hearing aids and sit up front so it would help. It didn't. Each class was fought with a considerable amount of stress. I would worry that the teacher would call on me and I'd make a fool out of myself. Often I did. It's hard to answer questions you don't understand. I felt a considerable amount of pressure to fit in with the hearing students. I tried my best to look like I knew what was going on at all times. My daily routine consisted of trying my darndest to understand what went on in class, yet at the same time maintain an air of nonchalantness so that I didn't stick out like a sore thumb. Nonetheless, a teacher would often approach me at the end of class to make sure I was okay. I would quickly brush off the teacher with false assurances that all was fine and dandy. A common scenario. Yes, Miss Wilson, I'm doing fine, no problem. A brief pause as the teacher leaves the classroom. Hey, Brian, what did she say the homework was? The essence of my 7th and 8th grade education was to bluff my way through class, then run up to a friendly student I knew I could depend on. I'd check with him to make sure I understood the homework assignment. Then, with that information, I would go home or to the library where I would review and catch up on everything I had missed in class. I wouldn't be too far off base to say that in my early years at GFS, I was self educated. Fortunately, I did have a considerable amount of support from certain caring individuals, including some very empathetic classmates. One of them, Dean, was in my Latin class. He played in the same summer baseball league and he knew me well enough to know that I was bluffing my way through Latin. Often, there were times when I couldn't understand what the teacher asked me, and my face would turn red with embarrassment and frustration. Rather than risk further ridicule, I would be content with saying, I don't know, and let someone else answer the question. Dean was on to me and tried his best to help. Sometimes I would respond with a I don't know to a ridiculous, easy question, and Dean wouldn't let me get away with it. Imagine, for example, a substitute teacher coming in and asking me what my name was. I don't know. Dean would jump in and help me save face. He would tap me on the shoulder, smile, and repeat the question slowly for me. His mannerisms made it clear that it was okay if I didn't understand what was going on. Few people gave me that type of reinforcement, and it was much appreciated. As for the faculty, they were demanding, but they also genuinely cared. They would challenge us in the classroom, making us think until our brains burst out of our ears. I knew I was in a really good school because the teachers were never satisfied with concrete answers. If you answered correctly on an exam to a question related to what had happened, of course you would get credit for it, but there would be red ink comments everywhere on the paper. The teachers also wanted to know why it had happened, what the dynamics were, and how things might have been different if. You get the idea? This was a school where you learned how to think outside the box. The teachers were not content with just answers. They wanted more questions. The teachers also took the time for private conferences with their students. Incidentally, I had plenty to make sure we were doing okay and if anything could further be done to facilitate our progress. So, if I gave the impression at times that I was unhappy at GFS, it had nothing to do with their program. I believe in my heart that GFS is the best high school anywhere. It's just that, as the only deaf student, I was often like a fish out of water. By the end of my first year at GFS, I would be rescued from academic hell by my beloved sport, baseball. Thanks to baseball, the year ended on a very positive note. I was a key part of the 7th grade baseball team, and I was finally having fun again. I may have stunk up the soccer field and the basketball court, making only the B teams on both, but with baseball, it was my turn to shine. We had a great team, and I made some more friends. Playing ball is a universal language for kids, so being deaf didn't really matter. It was around this time that there was a significant change at home. A chance encounter led to my mother accepting a new job at none other than the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf. She worked part-time on some evenings as a dorm counselor, and this was a huge paradigm shift, not just for her, but also for me. Occasionally, there was times when my mom took me along with her when she worked a shift at the PSD dorm. It was unbelievable. It was a totally different world. I had no idea how I can adequately describe what it felt like the first time I walked into the whole school full of deaf children. It was an awakening, a rebirth of sorts, and all communication shackles broke free. I can only attempt to describe how I felt. Mere words can't express it adequately enough, but they will have to do. Imagine that you were born in some small Atlantis at the bottom of the sea, and the only life you knew was to live in some glass bubble underwater. You could watch all the fish swim and play, but you weren't really a participant in that life. You were nothing more than an observer to most of the things that happened around you. But with the help of technology, you could put on scuba gear and swim with the fish. Unfortunately, the gear was heavy and uncomfortable, and as it helped you interact with the fish, you never were able to swim like them. You were different and you knew it. Suddenly, one day you decide to keep swimming upwards. Your friends, the fish, advised against it. Silly boy, they said. Everyone knows it's a liquid world. You have nothing to gain by going up to the surface. Air is too thin. Land is too hard. It's a liquid world. You've heard this argument before and you've always listened to it. On this occasion, however, you felt that it was time. Time to find out who you really were and everything you were all about. You swam all the way to the surface. And wonder of wonders, you found that there were thousands of people like you. You swam to the shore, and once you set your foot on land, you realized you didn't need all of that heavy scuba apparatus. You could run with the legs you were born with, and you could freely breathe in the natural air you were meant to breathe in. You could hold effortless conversations and have deep, meaningful relationship with others. Freedom at last. I can just see one of my old hearing classmates reading the above analogy and saying, "So what, am I a flounder?" No offense to my old classmates, but I genuinely felt a sense of freedom and involvement at PSD that I had never experienced anywhere else. When I met the other students in the PSD dorm for the first time, I felt a lightness, a jubilation that had never existed before. No straining to read lips, no struggling to keep up with conversations going on between two or more people, no pressure to pass myself off as a hearing person. We were equals, and I was learning the value of true, meaningful interaction. Everywhere I went, I could understand clearly what was being said, since everyone at PSD was signing. Although I had been discouraged from signing in my earlier years, I had picked up enough at home while watching my mom and dad sign to each other. Even though I wasn't a completely fluent signer myself, I knew enough to be able to interact with the deaf students at PSD. We played games, watched captioned movies, and had all kinds of fun. I never had to worry about fitting in or about catching up on missed information. The burden of trying to be something I'm not was temporarily lifted. Sign language made my life bearable again. Even my grandparents, who had ordinarily cooperated with doctors' advice that I should not sign on the erroneous premise that it was bad for my speech, took note that it was not that horrendous evil that it was made out to be. When my mother became more involved in the deaf community through PSD, the changes in her self-esteem and demeanor were so positive that for a short time my grandparents actually enrolled in sign language classes themselves. One evening in the spring of 1978, PSD held a Springfest event complete with carnival rides, games, fireworks, and a concert featuring songs performed in sign language. It was the most fun I'd ever had in the neighborhood. Deaf and hearing people alike interacted freely against each other and had the greatest time. For once, deafness was not bad. It actually seemed cool. My mind was made up then and there. Soon I would confront my parents. When school was out and I felt the time was right, I approached my mom one evening and asked if I could transfer to PSD. It wasn't fair for me to be so isolated at GFS. It was no fun being the only deaf student, except for the spring when I had baseball games to look forward to. I never really enjoyed going to school in the morning. I dreaded classroom discussions. I dreaded embarrassing myself when I misunderstood the teacher's questions or assignments, and heck, I was always bombing with the girls. While some girls were nice enough to make polite conversation, none of them were able to get to know me on a deeper level. It just didn't click. It was only a communication barrier, not a reflection of who I was. But nonetheless, I let this shoot my self-esteem to hell. I assumed that the girls simply wanted to hang out with the cool kids, not disabled geeks like me. At PSD, on the other hand, girls clearly liked me. They talked to me freely about anything, and I even had a brief puppy love thing going with a nice girl there when I was 14. Meanwhile, at GFS, I just wasn't getting any action. For a young, horny teenager, that's plenty of reason to transfer out of a school. Unfortunately, this horny teenager would have to wait. My mother and father gave me an empathetic no. I was not going to transfer to PSD. My mother actually gave it some thought and looked into it, and she made a grim discovery that she wasn't sure how to explain. The fact was, going into the 8th grade at GFS, I had already academically surpassed virtually all of the PSD seniors. In English, math, science, you name it, I had already done it. At PSD, I would have been taking an academic step backwards. At GFS, there were more mountains to climb. As my mother explained this, tears welled in my eyes. But Mom, they're my friends. My mother could only shake her head sadly. When my father heard how I felt about the whole thing, he tried to console me by sharing his own experience. When he was younger, he had similar academic potential, but he'd had no choice but to attend a deaf school. It did nothing for him. He began to explain a complicated social/academic phenomenon I would not really understand until much later. Since my father came from a deaf family in Scranton, Pennsylvania, he was able to grow up in an environment where he had access to communication. Developmentally, he was on par with other hearing children. The only difference between deaf children and deaf families and hearing children and hearing families is the mode of communication. In one, they sign, in the other, they speak. As many parents will attest, a favorite word of all young toddlers is why. Why does it get dark at night? Why do I have to take a bath? Why is the goldfish floating upside down? Why do Aunt Emma's teeth fall out? Why am I deaf? Why? Whether amusing or annoying, we owe it to our children to answer as many of their whys as possible. When we take the time to do this, children internalize crucial information. This greatly enhances their overall development in terms of thought processing and general knowledge acquisition. Unfortunately, such favorable environments of communication do not exist for most deaf kids. 90% of deaf children have hearing parents, and usually there's a significant communication gap. Often, hearing parents do not know sign language. The deaf child has to lip read, and reading lips is difficult. Only about 35% of spoken language can be lip read because most sounds are formed in the back of the mouth. Many sounds are next to impossible to decipher, no matter where they originate. For example, B, P, and M look virtually identical from a lip reading standpoint. If Ben is one of the men who got a new pen, it's going to take me a while to figure it out. If Mark went to the park, or if Mom is the bomb, I'm scratching my head. Is that Matt at bat, or is it Pat? Pass the aspirin, please. Imagine trying to answer all of your kids' why questions in such a manner that he or she can only understand 35% of what you're saying. Many parents try their best only to give up in frustration. I've seen it happen many times, and it's painful to watch. Instead of genuinely conversing with their deaf children, many parents wave off questions with a never mind that makes deaf kids feel they are not important. Some hearing parents respond to their deaf children with trust answers or just say, no, don't do that, without explaining why it's not a good idea to shave the cat. No bona fide communication, nothing learned. Considering most deaf children come from hearing families that do not sign, they probably start their school years having to play catch up. Their vocabulary base is severely limited as compared to hearing children who can understand and interact with their hearing parents. My father explained that when he moved to Philadelphia as a teenager, he attended two deaf schools, PSD and the Martin School. Not only did he have to pass the time in classes where he was way ahead of everyone linguistically and academically, but he also had to put up with the then enforced oral philosophy of both schools. Sign language was forbidden for the same reason the doctors had told my grandparents not to let me use it. It was believed that in order to be successful, all deaf people must speak. This philosophy has thrown a monkey wrench into the academic careers of countless deaf students. Many deaf children have gone through school and learned nothing because they were being trained to be something they simply weren't. If you had your choice, would you rather that your kids spend 6 years learning how to successfully pronounce the word ball, or would you rather have those 6 years be invested in signing clearly to him the concepts of modern science, literature, and mathematics? This is a no-brainer, right? Guess again. Believe it or not, this argument is still hotly debated. Oralism has worked for some deaf children, and it has ruined the lives of others. It's a very controversial topic. At PSD, however, the administration and the deaf community eventually realized that the oral approach resulted in more frustration than success. It was clearly not working with this particular population of deaf students. It was a horror story. My father pointed out how one of his teachers used to hit him on the hand with a ruler whenever he signed, and one day, in total frustration, she actually began smacking him on the ears, hollering, "You can hear, you can hear." My dad also told me about his friend Ted, who could never learn how to speak, no matter how hard he tried. He would put in a good effort, but always to no avail. And my father thought it was absolutely disgusting how the teachers would gush, "Oh, that's wonderful," whenever Ted managed to emit a guttural sound that bore no resemblance to any spoken word whatsoever. At times like these, my dad confessed that he often wondered why teachers and administrators couldn't see the obvious. If they would have simply allowed sign language in the classroom, they would have easily covered more material at a much faster rate. Instead, they wasted valuable time trying to pronounce George Washington without getting to whatever it was about this Mr. Washington had done that was so important. Regardless, speech was the number one priority throughout my dad's school years. Often he watched in bemusement as teachers picked on poor Ted. Finally, one of them pushed Ted way beyond the limit of his tolerance. Completely exasperated, Ted cut loose with the one word he could pronounce correctly: freak. But that wasn't the F word he had said. My dad did his best to restrain his laughter, lest he wound up on the receiving end of another hard slap. Nonetheless, he was very amused. The teacher didn't know how to react. Should she congratulate the boy or send him to the principal's office? Ted had finally, after all these years, pronounced a word correctly, and it was a word that would have made George Carlin proud. Wonderful. Neither Ted nor my father would ever forget this special breakthrough. Years later, my dad visited Ted and found that he had an adorable new dog. Ted explained that, yes, it was a cute dog and all, but he was irked because his wife had given the dog a name he couldn't pronounce. Ted, going against his wife's wishes, went ahead and named the dog the only thing he could call it. "Watch this," signed Ted. And with a mischievous smile on his face, he took a deep breath. "Freak!" Yes, sir. Sure enough, the pooch came bouncing in, and his tail wagging affectionately. Never mind that the dog had already knew how to respond to several commands in sign language. It was only one word, but it was Ted's biggest triumph from the good old oral school days. Several years after these oral school antics, PSD had a change of philosophy. Sometime in the early 70s, they had switched to use of total communication in the classroom. using whichever communication method best met the needs of the students. Most teachers, in my opinion, appeared to use SimCom. They involved utilizing spoken words that were supported by their corresponding signs. It was not fluent ASL, but it was a step in the right direction. Students finally had access to a lot more information than they ever had before. Note, later on, a teacher who had been at PSD during both the oral and the TC days confided to me that the students did indeed absorb educational content much faster when sign language was implemented. Furthermore, on down the road, PSD would eventually adopt a strong philosophy supporting the use of ASL in the classroom. They would take many other steps to close the communication gap, such as implementing a successful early intervention program. At that point in time when I wanted to transfer, however, the gap was still huge. For even if PSD had improved their communication philosophy in school, there was nothing much it could do to improve things from the students at home and in the outside world. It's been said that 92% of all learning happens at home. So, what can a school do to make up the difference? It's always been a difficult game of catch up and probably always will be. Once my father was done explaining the pitfalls of deaf education, he pointed out that I was lucky to get such a wonderful opportunity at GFS. I was lucky to have had enough residual hearing, which allowed me to get by in the hearing world before I went deaf, and I was lucky to have supportive deaf parents after I did. I was lucky to have the cognitive skills to be able to survive at GFS. If he had been given such a choice, my father would have gone with GFS hands down, no pun intended. The education of deaf children still had a long way to go, he explained, so I might as well take advantage of my ability to succeed at GFS. If I had what it took to just barely make it, and it looked like I did, why not just hang in there? Maybe someday I would learn enough to help turn things around in the deaf world. For now, though, the deaf world would have to wait. I wasn't joining it just yet. After the unsuccessful attempt to convincing my parents to let me transfer, I grudgingly returned to GFS. I cursed my luck. Why couldn't I have been prelingually deaf? Had I been born completely deaf, people would have left me alone. I wouldn't have been in the situation trying to be this pseudo-hearing person that I was. I didn't fit into the hearing world, and I wasn't allowed to be a part of the deaf world. I was too different. So, as my year in the 8th grade drew to a close, I had done it again by using mirrors, smoke screens, and the deadly martial art of bluff you. I had successfully given the impression that I knew and understood most of what was going on. I had grown tiresome. I had especially dreaded Wednesday assemblies where I would sit there bored out of my mind while someone gave a speech, presentation, or a musical performance. Why didn't I just speak up and tell everyone that it was a waste of time? Of course, I never complained. Good boy, be hearing. Even if my smile when everyone smiles, laugh when everyone laughs routine gave enough people the impression that I was hearing for reasonable or reasonably close, it didn't fool everyone. My teachers were no idiots. They'd been keeping an eye on me all along. They knew I was getting by in my own way, but they also knew it wasn't going to last much longer. While the 7th and 8th grade consisted of mostly hands-on work and following textbook assignments, the 9th through 12th grades were a whole new ballgame. In those upper grades, there would be an emphasis on classroom discussions. Instead of the teacher lecturing and leading us through textbook questions that were easier for me to follow, the whole class would be discussing various topics in depth. We would all be learning from each other. Everyone, that is, except for the deaf guy. The teachers, however, knew that I was really going to be in a fog if I had to follow an entire classroom discussion on my own. They realized that if I were to remain at GFS, I would need some kind of extra support. Some consultation was done, and my mother gave me the news over the summer. I was going to get a sign language interpreter. My reaction left no doubt about how I felt. No! I went into a big funk over this. It was bad enough that on many occasions I'd made a fool out of myself trying to act like I knew what was going on. I was a world champion nodder, saying yes to a lot of things people said in casual conversation. My personal rule was to always say, I don't know, to the teachers and yeah, to the students whenever I could understand anything. I thought this was a very efficient way of camouflaging my deafness. Of course, it didn't always work. Hey Mark, how'd you do on the biology test? Smiling, yeah. Hey Mark, what time do you have gym today? Smiling, yeah. Hey Mark, want to look at ashtray? Smiling, yeah. Despite such incidents, I still believe that most of the time I managed to blend in. With an interpreter, though, I was screwed. Everyone would see every minute of every day that I was deaf. There was no hiding from this. Everyone would look at me like I was the class freak. I was incredibly self-conscious about this, and my self-esteem was beyond shot. It was at an all-time low. Shortly before the end of 8th grade, I was informed that I'd be referred to a psychologist. My grade advisor had noted my behavior and my obviously low self-esteem. He'd seen enough to know that such a referral was necessary. Of course, I protested. My mother got the blunt of this. She had to put up with my ranting and raving. What am I, nuts? I'm not going to any psychologist. They're for people who are sick in the head. Do I look sick to you? Psychologists are head shrinkers. What's next? A witch doctor? Booga booga booga. Hey, well, while you're at it, why not call an exorcist? Aw, man, I wish everyone would just leave me alone. This stinks. They're just sending me there because I'm deaf. They think I'm deaf and dumb. I don't need any help. On and on I went, but to no avail. My mother had to drag me there, but off to the psychologist I went. My first session with the psychologist did not turn out to be the head-shrinking, brain-picking session I had feared it would be. Being as self-conscious as I was, I just couldn't stand the thought of sitting with a person whose sole purpose was to analyze me. But my fear immediately turned into a sense of comfort and relief when I found that my psychologist was a caring woman who signed. Seeing that she could sign fluently and that she understood deafness meant a lot to me. I relaxed and my intentional streak of rebelliousness evaporated. After some small talk and getting to know each other, I was asked to go through some psychological evaluation tests. I went through the usual battery of tests that measured my academic levels as well as my psychological well-being. At first, I was apprehensive about this, but the psychologist made me feel better by explaining in detail why she had to run me through the whole thing. It meant a lot to me to be able to know exactly what was going on. You mean I have to do this to rule out the fact that I might be nuts? I asked. She grinned, reassured me that I wasn't nuts, and we went on to the testing. As we went through it, I actually began to have fun. I knew I was doing pretty good and just enjoyed it as an opportunity to show off what I could do. The following week, I beamed with pride as the psychologist told me that my test results were way above average. In fact, she also said that she didn't think I needed to see her much longer. She remarked that she could see how I had accomplished so much against incredible odds, and she respected that. All I really needed, in her opinion, was a pat on the back. Then we moved on to talking about what was going on in school and with my family. I got a lot off my chest. The pressure of trying to be like a hearing person, the embarrassment when I couldn't, being made fun of, and wishing I could be around other deaf who were just like me. The psychologist acknowledged all of my concerns. For good measure, she told me that she would go over a few things with my family. She already noticed that what my grandfather told her about me was completely different from what she saw with her own eyes. My grandfather had painted a bleak picture of how I was not good enough at several things, particularly speech. The psychologist informed me that my speech was far better than what she'd been led to expect, but that was irrelevant. The important thing was that my grandparents needed to acknowledge that I was deaf and that I was doing incredibly well considering the circumstances. My grades were better than a lot of hearing students, but to my grandfather, it wasn't enough. During report card time, he would grill me on every teacher's written comments about how I need to sit up closer, wear my hearing aid more, and be more involved in class discussion. Never mind how good my grades were, I needed to be more hearing. But no means am I advocating a parenting philosophy of, oh, don't be so hard on him, he's deaf. Anything but. In situations where a teacher reported that I didn't give enough effort on a certain project or failed to study enough for an exam, the admonitions I got for it were appropriately called for. But there were some reprimands that I did not deserve. Reprimands based on comments such as the following example. Actually, quotes from some of my report cards. I would have liked seeing Mark make greater contribution to class discussion. He does not keep track of where we are in discussion. I urge Mark to sit up front, focus his attention. Although there were many positive comments in my report cards where the teachers acknowledged I had overcome a lot of adversity, my grandfather always gave me a hard time about my lack of involvement in class discussions. Sure, I'm grateful he pushed me hard academically, for it enabled me to set higher standards for myself. His only mistake was in pushing me to be more hearing. That would accomplish nothing except for maybe turning me into a neurotic. And then, shortly before the ninth grade began, I was at my grandparents' apartment when my grandfather called me into the den for yet another private conversation. We had countless meetings like this before, and I grew to detest them, but this time it was different. Mark, he began, this year is going to be a challenge for you. You've got a lot going on, but you've accomplished more than many people thought possible. I just wanted to say that you've proven yourself quite well. I'm not going to bother you anymore about GFS, Mark. You're on your own now. I was completely surprised. It was a complete turnaround from what I had been expecting from him. Although in general he was a fun guy to be with, as far as school was concerned, he's always been dead serious. Perhaps he felt that I needed to be 10 times better than everyone else in order to compensate for my deafness. Whatever it was a big, unexpected surprise when he told me I was on my own. If I had any problems and needed advice, of course, he would be there. If I ever turned in a lousy report card, then it would be up to my deaf parents to say something, as it should be. Now my grandfather could go back to being just that, a grandfather. The same went for my grandmother, who had also shown a considerable amount of worry and concern over my academics. Our relationship greatly improved after this announcement. I could go back to enjoying their company without rolling my eyes whenever a school-related issue came up. When I rode back home with my mother that afternoon, she explained the reason behind what had just happened. The psychologist had actually called my grandfather for a private discussion of their own. Basically, she told him to wake up and smell the roses. He'd been so worried about my deafness that he had failed to see the great picture. Overall, I was doing pretty well. With all that said and done, I felt vindicated. See? I told you I wasn't nuts.